What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. It's Ryan, former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and I've flown airliners for years on top of that, and today we're breaking down the U.S. retaliatory strikes against the IRGC after Iran targeted our troops in Jordan, because this is a real confirmed sequence of events from just the past couple of weeks, and I want to walk you through exactly what happened, what CENTCOM actually said, how big this response really was, and what happened right after. Because I think the full picture here matters a lot more than any single dramatic headline. So let's get into it. First, let's set the timeline, because this specific chapter of the broader war didn't come out of nowhere. It came right on the heels of a brief pause in the fighting. On Friday, July 25th, Trump had announced he was pausing U.S. strikes on Iran to give diplomacy another chance, saying Iran and other regional countries had asked for that pause and that the perimeters of a deal had been agreed to. That pause held for a handful of days. Then on Tuesday, July 28th, while Trump was actually meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu in the Oval Office, Iran launched multiple ballistic missiles toward the Muwaffaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, a base that hosts a significant number of the roughly 4,000 U.S. troops stationed in that country. CENTCOM described it as an attempted surprise attack and confirmed that all of the missiles were intercepted, meaning no American personnel were hurt in that specific attack. No damage got through. The defenses did their job. Jordan's own armed forces said they intercepted 5 of the missiles themselves as part of that broader defensive effort. The IRGC claimed responsibility directly, saying its Air Force had targeted the Muwaffaq Salti Air Base along with a CENTCOM-related facility in Jordan, and putting out a statement saying that as long as threats against Iran and, in their words, illegal and vicious actions by American forces against Iranian interests continue, the resistance will continue as well. That attack mattered for a specific reason. Beyond just the immediate danger, it marked Iran's first ballistic missile attack against a U.S. base in the region since that pause had gone into effect just a few days earlier, which meant it immediately threatened to unravel the fragile diplomatic window that had just opened up. And Trump responded fast and publicly, telling Fox News that same day, quote, "We'll be hitting them hard," making clear this wasn't going to go unanswered. So less than 24 hours later, at 10 p. MSU Eastern Time on Wednesday, July 29th, CENTCOM announced it had, in its own words, successfully completed a heavy wave of strikes against Iran. And I want to read you exactly how CENTCOM characterized the scope of this, because I think the actual language matters here more than any paraphrase. They said the strikes hit dozens of IRGC targets, and they specifically listed the categories: military command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance and defense sites, and maritime capabilities. That's a genuinely broad target set. It's not a single symbolic strike against one facility. It's a coordinated operation going after multiple different layers of Iran's military infrastructure simultaneously: command and control, weapons production and storage, and their ability to monitor and defend their own coastline. In terms of the human cost from that specific round of strikes, Iranian state media reported that 3 civilians were killed, and the IRGC itself confirmed that 3 of its own personnel were killed in the strikes as well. I want to be straightforward about those numbers because I think it's important not to inflate or downplay them in either direction. This was a real lethal military operation with confirmed casualties on the Iranian side, but it's also worth being clear that the reported death toll from this specific wave, at least based on what's been publicly confirmed, was in the single digits rather than some kind of mass casualty event, even though the target list itself was described as covering dozens of separate sites. Now here's a detail I think is genuinely important context, and it happened basically in parallel with all of this. On that same Wednesday, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia conducted their own separate joint strikes in Iraq, specifically targeting Iran-backed militia groups operating under the Popular Mobilization Forces umbrella. Those strikes killed at least 20 members of the PMF and wounded 32 others, according to the group itself. It's actually not entirely clear from the reporting whether Iran's attack on Jordan happened before or after that U.S. Saudi strike on the Iraqi militias. CENTCOM's own statement didn't clarify the sequencing, which tells you how compressed and chaotic this specific stretch of the war actually was, multiple fronts activating almost simultaneously within roughly a 24 to 48 hour window. I also want to mention something that happened just a couple weeks before all of this, because I think it's directly relevant context for understanding just how personal and immediate the stakes were for American forces in this specific theater. Back on July 18th, 2 U.S. troops were killed in an earlier Iranian missile attack on a base in Jordan, and that was reported at the time as the first American combat deaths since fighting had resumed after an earlier ceasefire collapse. So when this new attack happened on July 28th, targeting essentially the same country and reportedly some of the same general basing infrastructure, that wasn't an isolated, out-of-nowhere provocation. It was part of a pattern of Iran repeatedly targeting you. S positions in Jordan specifically, with American service members having already paid a real price from that exact type of attack just 10 days earlier. So let's talk about what these specific target categories actually mean from a military capability standpoint, because I think understanding what CENTCOM says it hit tells you a lot about the actual intent behind this operation. Military command centers are exactly what they sound like. Facilities where IRGC leadership plans, coordinates, and directs operations. Hitting those disrupts an adversary's ability to organize follow-on attacks and degrades their overall command and control effectiveness, at least temporarily. Missile and drone facilities cover both production and storage. Hitting these directly reduces Iran's physical stockpile of the exact weapons they've been using to attack U.S. and allied positions throughout this war, and also slows down their ability to replenish those stockpiles going forward. Coastal surveillance and defense sites are about degrading Iran's ability to monitor and defend its own coastline, which ties directly into the broader ongoing fight over the Strait of Hormuz that I've covered in earlier videos. If you can't see threats approaching your coast as effectively, your ability to contest control of that waterway gets weaker. And maritime capabilities specifically likely refers to the same kind of fast attack boats and mine-laying vessels that have been used throughout this conflict to threaten shipping and harass U.S. naval forces in the Gulf. So putting that together, this wasn't a narrow, symbolic retaliatory strike aimed at just checking a box after the Jordan attack. It was a genuinely broad operation aimed at degrading multiple different layers of Iran's military capability at once, which lines up with the heavy wave language CENTCOM itself used to describe it. Now, I want to walk through what happened right after this because I think this is honestly the most important part of the story if you're trying to figure out whether this strike actually changed the trajectory of the conflict in any meaningful way, or whether it was just another entry in the same back-and-forth pattern we've seen play out repeatedly throughout this war. Just 2 days later, on Friday, July 31st, Iran announced it had targeted U.S. military assets at Kuwait's Ahmad al-Jaber Air Base, describing it explicitly as retaliation for the U.S. strikes from a day or two earlier. According to a statement carried by Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency, Iran's army said it had used drones to target hangars, satellite communication systems, and equipment warehouses at that base. So within roughly 72 hours, you had this complete cycle play out. Iran strikes Jordan, the U.S. responds with a heavy wave of strikes against dozens of IRGC targets inside Iran, and then Iran retaliates again with a drone attack against a different U.S. base, this time in Kuwait. That's a really important detail for understanding what obliterated actually means in the context of this specific operation, because if IRGC capability had genuinely been obliterated in any comprehensive sense, you wouldn't expect to see them mount another coordinated drone attack against a separate U.S. facility just days later. What you're actually looking at is a real and substantial degradation of specific target sets, dozens of facilities actually hit, real military infrastructure destroyed, but not a knockout blow that ended Iran's capacity or willingness to keep striking back. I also came across an analysis from a regional expert named Darini that I think frames this dynamic really well, and I want to share it because I think it captures the strategic logic behind this pattern better than most of the surface level coverage. The framing is that Washington has been pursuing what's described as vertical escalation, meaning ramping up the intensity and scope of military attacks against Iran directly, while Tehran has been pursuing what's described as horizontal escalation, meaning expanding the conflict's geographical scope instead, spreading attacks across Jordan, Kuwait, Iraq, and other locations throughout the region rather than trying to match U.S. strike intensity head-on inside Iran itself. And the analyst's broader point was blunt. Iran wants a complete permanent end to the war, or it's going to become a wide-scale regional war. That's a pretty stark way of framing where things actually stand, and I think it's a more useful lens for understanding this specific exchange than just treating it as a simple story of the U.S. winning a single round. I also want to bring in the broader pattern here, because this exact sequence, Iran attacks a U.S. or allied position, the U.S. responds with a heavy wave of strikes. Iran retaliates again somewhere else in the region isn't actually new to this specific week. It's been the recurring rhythm of large stretches of this entire war going back to when it started on February 28th. Just to give you some sense of how consistently this pattern has repeated itself, Iran struck the UAE directly in the opening days of the war, killing 3 foreign workers and injuring 58 others. Iran struck Kuwait multiple times throughout the conflict. In one earlier incident, killing 6 U.S. soldiers and wounding dozens more, with a genuinely tragic friendly fire incident where a Kuwaiti FA-18 accidentally shot down 3 American F-15Es during that engagement, though thankfully the American crews survived that incident. Iran and its proxy forces have also struck British military facilities supporting the U.S. effort, hit targets in Iraq repeatedly, and continued threatening shipping through Hormuz throughout this entire period. So the July 28th through 31st sequence I just walked you through isn't some kind of unique standalone escalation. It's really just the most recent iteration of a pattern that's been running on repeat for 5 months now. Let me also touch on why the U.S. responds with these heavy, broad target lists rather than narrower, more surgical retaliatory strikes, because I think there's real doctrine behind that choice that's worth understanding. When you're dealing with an adversary that's demonstrated a willingness to repeatedly strike your forces across multiple countries using missiles and drones, a narrow, one-for-one retaliatory strike, hitting just the specific unit or launch site responsible for that particular attack, doesn't do much to actually change the other side's calculus going forward, because their broader capability to keep doing this remains largely intact. Going after a genuinely broad target set instead, command centers, weapons stockpiles, surveillance infrastructure, and naval capability all at once, is meant to impose real cumulative cost across their whole military apparatus, not just punish the specific unit responsible for one specific attack. That's the reasoning behind CENTCOM specifically emphasizing that this was a heavy wave hitting dozens of targets, rather than describing it as a small, contained response. Now, let me give you my honest take here as someone who's spent a career around military operations and understands how these campaigns tend to actually play out over time. I think what happened on July 29th was a genuinely significant and substantial military operation, hitting dozens of real IRGC targets across multiple capability categories in a single coordinated wave, is a serious application of American air power, and it absolutely represents real, meaningful degradation of specific pieces of Iran's military infrastructure, their command facilities, their missile and drone stockpiles, their coastal surveillance network, and their naval assets all took a real hit that night. That part of the obliterated framing has real substance behind it. This wasn't a token or symbolic gesture, but I also think the honest, complete picture requires acknowledging what happened in the days right after, because Iran's ability and willingness to strike back at a completely different U.S. facility in Kuwait just 2 days later tells you clearly that this wasn't a war-ending or even capability-ending blow. What you're actually looking at is one more heavy exchange in what has become a genuinely extended, grinding back-and-forth conflict, where both sides have repeatedly proven capable of absorbing serious hits and continuing to fight. I think that's actually the more useful and more accurate way to think about stories like this one going forward, rather than treating any single strike, however large and however well documented by CENTCOM's own public statements, as a decisive turning point in the war. I also want to mention, because I think it connects directly to something I covered in an earlier video, that this entire sequence happened during the exact same window when Trump had separately announced he was pausing a planned massive strike on Iran at Tehran's request, citing progress toward some kind of deal. So you had this genuinely strange dynamic playing out simultaneously. Public talk of a deal being close and strikes being called off, happening in the very same days that Iran was launching ballistic missiles at a U.S. base, and the U.S. was responding with a heavy wave of strikes against dozens of IRGC targets. That tells you just how fragile and disconnected the diplomatic track and the military track have been running from each other throughout this entire conflict. Official statements about progress toward peace and actual missiles flying back and forth have been happening at the same time on multiple separate occasions now, which is exactly the kind of pattern I flagged in my last video on this war too. So that's the complete, accurate breakdown of what actually happened. Iran struck a U.S. base in Jordan with ballistic missiles that were fully intercepted, the U.S. responded less than 24 hours later with a heavy wave of strikes against dozens of confirmed IRGC targets across multiple capability categories. And Iran retaliated again just 2 days after that with a drone attack against a different U.S. facility in Kuwait, all of it unfolding while separate diplomatic talk of a pause and a possible deal was happening in parallel. That's a real, serious, and consequential exchange, and I think it deserves to be understood in its full context, rather than compressed down into a single triumphant headline that doesn't account for what actually happened in the days immediately following it. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Do you think this kind of heavy retaliatory response actually changes Iran's calculus going forward? Or do you think we're just going to keep watching this exact same cycle repeat itself the way it has multiple times already this year? I'd genuinely love to hear where you land on this. And if you want more breakdowns like this, where I walk you through the confirmed facts and the full context rather than just the headline, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps me keep putting this kind of content out. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, signing off.